Hello, I'm Dr. Lawrence Brown with the Real News Network. I'm here with Dr. Karsonya Wise Whitehead, author, professor, teacher, and documentary filmmaker. Dr. Wise Whitehead is an associate professor of communication and African American studies in the Department of Communication at Loyola University in Maryland. She's written 3 books we will discuss, along with what's happening right now in Baltimore. Dr. Whitehead, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be on the show.
So a few months ago, I heard you give a riveting lecture at Johns Hopkins University about slavery and the way that it existed then on the land where the university now sits. And I wanted to know, what was slavery like then in Baltimore, and especially on the land where Johns Hopkins now sits?
I think this is an exciting time to talk about spaces and to talk about the ways in which we understand and interact with the history of these spaces. The Black History Month theme for next year in 2016 is actually around hallowed memories and around this notion that the place, the environment, matters just as much as the experience. So when Hopkins invited me over, it was to really take a look at and discuss what life would have been like for enslaved Black people on that particular land. I mean, it's a university now. People move through the university not really knowing that enslaved people were actually there at some point. And so this particular lecture was a way to make this real to people, to talk about what their lives might have been like, to help people understand that Maryland has a very distinct and unique history when it comes to American enslavement. You had a place where you had both free Blacks and enslaved Blacks coming in close contact with one another. You have 2 different stories, actually. You have the Harriet Tubman story and you have the Frederick Douglass story, both happening in Maryland, but very, very different. I mean, of course, Frederick Douglass, like Harriet Tubman, was born enslaved, but his life after that was not of a typical experience, and as well as hers wasn't either. So it was really trying to help people begin to make sense of Maryland's very unique and distinct history, and also tell the story from those that were enslaved rather than the perspective of those who enslaved people.
That's very interesting. At the time, of course, Maryland in some ways still is a border state. How does that play out, you think, into the way enslavement was practiced here in the state and in the city of Baltimore specifically?
I think we can see the impact of that even today. I mean, when you talk about what happened in South Carolina around this notion of a discussion around the Confederate flag, well, you can drive through parts of Maryland and you can see the Confederate flag flying outside people's homes, painted on the side of the trucks, being worn as T-shirts or on license plates. So Maryland, as a border state, really came into conflict with this notion of free versus being enslaved. And there are places in Maryland where when you go there, as a person who is a Black American kind of living this American experience, it can be rather difficult and challenging even today. Even the ways in which we talk about Freddie Gray, the ways in which we talk about Tyrone West, the ways in which we talk about Black Lives Matter in Maryland is a very different conversation than, say, in New York or in Ohio or even in South Carolina, where you're very clear about where South Carolinians stand for the most part about Black Lives Matter. In Maryland, it depends upon where you are. It depends upon what circle you're in. It depends upon what university you find yourself in. It's different conversations because Maryland is a very difficult place when it comes to understanding the history of our country dealing with American enslavement.
So you mentioned earlier that slavery takes place on this land where Johns Hopkins University now sits. What was that experience like? How did enslavement look on the land where that campus now sits?
I think it's interesting when we talk about American enslavement that people understand that there were really 2 different types of enslaved experiences. You have the story that's usually told about the plantation. You have this notion of people working in the fields from sun up to sundown, or being at the beck and call of the plantation owner, whether it was to make food or to make blankets, or even sometimes to have church and to make music. Well, as you move further up, the experiences begin to change. So you had enslaved people in some parts of Maryland, of course, on plantations, but in other parts, like that land, they lived in these homesteads, in a sense, where they were taking care of huge blocks of land, almost like factories, where they were working and they were keeping this going, they were keeping the industry going, they were helping to support this family in ways that were very different than the ways that they supported, say, deeper south. So even though they were enslaved and it was a challenging experiences, they had different ways that they negotiated freedom than you would have if you were, say, in Atlanta or if you were in South Carolina. because you were, at some times of the day, actually in charge of your time. Whether you were back home in your own cabin, whether you had your own time in the kitchen, where you can negotiate what freedom or moments of freedom look like for you.
So you wrote a book about the quest for freedom during this period called Notes of a Colored Girl, the Civil War Pocket Diaries of Emily Frances Davis. Who is Miss Davis?
It's very interesting because the story of Emily Frances Davis has probably become my siren song. I mean, I talk about Emily. I think you can bring my sons in here and they can talk about Emily. She's so important to our lives. But many years ago when I was a school teacher here in Baltimore City, prior to going into the academy and after being a documentary filmmaker, I had this dream of wanting to give back. We had just moved to Baltimore, and I wanted to work in the school system and give back and work with young people. I had visions of kids in blue linen, you know, bringing me apples, excited for my knowledge. And I found a very different experience going into a persistently dangerous school. And while I was working in this school, working in the hearts and minds of young people, a very exciting time for me, where you really stand as that person in front of that gate between perhaps a young person choosing the pencil or choosing the penitentiary. Like, you can put them and push them towards the right track, or you might lose them. So it was really a challenging time for me. A very good friend sent me copies of a diary that she had found in the basement of a historical society. It was a box that was earmarked for the trash. And she pulled it out, she made copies, she mailed it to me. And she said, you know, I pulled these out of the trash, what do you think? Should I save them? And so in the beginning, when I first started reading these diaries from 1863, 64, and 65, I thought they were written by a white woman, because it's the height of the Civil War. And this woman is writing about going to get ice cream and dating and getting her hair cut. I assumed it was a white woman, because during the Civil War, I wasn't thinking that people were dating and getting ice cream. But I thought everybody who was a person of color was involved with war efforts. And it wasn't until I got to the August entries from 1863 where Emily Frances Davis racially self-identifies. She was visiting a church by the water in Philadelphia. She's based in Philadelphia. And she wrote, "We was the only colored people in the room." And that really changed my life. That one sentence changed my life.
We was the
only colored people in the room. It was an amazing experience for me at 2 a.m. in the morning, where I'm screaming in the house, because I realized at that moment what I was holding. I was holding copies of a diary written by a black woman in 1863, a name I had never heard of, a story I had never been told. I studied African-American history in undergraduate at Lincoln University, and I knew the names of people who had kept diaries at that time. I mean, I knew, you know, Ida B. Wells and Alice Dunbar Nelson and Charlotte Fortune. I knew these names. I did not know the name of Emily Frances Davis. I decided then, at that moment, that I wanted to go and get my PhD and learn how to work on these diaries. At that moment, 2 o'clock in the morning, I said, no, I need to go and get my PhD. Because I didn't think I could do her justice if I didn't know how to do the research. And so I attended the UMBC, wonderful program, and they taught me how to transcribe the diaries, how to annotate the diaries, and Notes from a Colored Girl is a full transcription of Emily Frances Davis's 3 years worth of diaries, and also a 6-chapter build out of her life. I mean, I found her in church records in Philadelphia. I found her in the records from the Institute for Colored Youth, which is now Cheney University. She was attending school at that time. I found her at First African Presbyterian Church, which had Jonathan Gibbs as the pastor, a huge church. I found that she was actually sitting in lectures with Frederick Douglass, because she would go to Mother Bethel and she would write about how Frederick Douglass was giving a speech. She was attending meetings at the home of William Still, who was a very well-known abolitionist at that time, and she would talk about meetings at his house. So that changed my life and pushed me on a point where I find myself today, where Emily has become my life's work.
Now, you've also written another book, Sparking the Genius, which also talks about these key critical moments in civil rights movement history. I guess moving forward from Emily Davis, what are some of those key moments that you see in African American history?
Sparking the Genius, the Carter G. Woodson lecture, it was a lecture that I gave at the ASALA conference, which is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Carter G. Woodson's organization. I mean, they're in charge of the Black History Month theme every year. And I was selected to do the Carter G. Woodson lecture, which was an amazing moment in my life because every one of my historian heroes and sheroes have done that lecture, from Donald Franklin to Skip Gates. So to be selected in 2013, which was the anniversary year, when you talk about the events that happened in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the events that happened in 1963, from the March on Washington to the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church to what happened to Medgar Evers. I mean, this was a big year. We were celebrating either the 50th anniversary or even the 150th anniversary of key moments in African American history. So the Carter G. Woodson lecture talks about ways that we can spark the genius of young people. How can we get them excited about their history? Even though in many history classrooms around the country, Black people aren't talked about till February, which is my own personal struggle. It's the battle that I have committed myself to fighting against, because our history should be embedded within the American history curriculum and not taught separately. But until people can accept that, then we have to continue to have Black History Month, because if we didn't, there'll be schools around this country that wouldn't talk about the contributions of Black people at all, except for Barack Obama, because they have to as president.
Right.
But they don't have to talk about W.B. Du Bois or Mary McLeod Bethune. They don't have to talk about Frederick Douglass. They don't have to talk about, Booker T. Washington. They don't have to talk about these people, but in Black History Month, they do. And it is just pushed over their head, from a Coca-Cola commercial, which I'm not sure if I agree with that, to even a Budweiser commercial. Everyone's talking about Black history, and that is a time where it becomes part of the conversation. So until that day comes where it is seen as a part of the American history curriculum, then we continue to have Black History Month. So the Carter G. Woodson lecture talks about what we can do as parents, as teachers, as researchers, as scholars, as media people like yourself, what we can do to spark the genius of young people. Carter G. Woodson, in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, said that we have to spark the genius of young people and, in a sense, set them on fire and set them loose into the world. And my book talks about that.
That's very powerful. And, I realize that we're here in a critical moment. We're sitting here in the midst of a passionate movement, Black Lives Matter, which really kicked off after the death and the murder of Trayvon Martin at the hands of George Zimmerman. You've written a book called Raising My Black Sons, Raising Boys in a Post-Racial America. What are the types of things that we should be telling our boys and even our girls about this time in which we're living?
This is a critical moment, and I would argue that when we look back in 50 years, when others look back in 100 years, they will look back with the same type of awe and reverence that we look back at the Civil Rights Movement. That when we take a critical look at the Civil Rights Movement, that we should be dumbstruck by the contributions that our ancestors made, by the sacrifices that they made, by the work that they did every single day, realizing that the pursuit of freedom, the pursuit of equality, the pursuit of justice, I mean, this is a marathon, right? This is not a sprint. And they realized that they were picking up the mantle of a struggle that's been going on for years. And we can go all the way back, right, to Francis Allen Watkins Harper, talking about a Baltimore poet from the 1860s. We can go back there and talk about the struggle and work that Black people have been doing in this country in pursuit of freedom, equality, and justice from the very beginnings of our history here. Black Lives Matter, I believe, is the next step in that. And even though it kicked off, with 3 Black women after the murder of Trayvon Martin, I argue that it really picked up steam after the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson. That Black Lives Matter wasn't Black Lives Matter until people started saying Black Lives Matter. Because you can have all kinds of movements on Twitter. I'm in the middle of a movement now for Black mommy activism. Until other people start picking this up as a movement, then it's a Twitter handle, right? It's just a hashtag. But when it was picked up in Ferguson, when all of a sudden the movement was tweeted, and the movement was Facebook. I'm not sure Facebook is a word, but the last poets used to rap about, and I know you remember this, how the movement will not be televised, right? That there's a movement happening, you won't know about it if you're watching TV. Well, social media has changed that because Ferguson was tweeted. Ferguson was on Facebook. We were following Ferguson in real time and hearing people say every day that Black lives matter, and then have that fire get picked up all over the world. That you had, Tibetan monks saying Black Lives Matter. You had folks in New York and California and Baltimore saying Black Lives Matter, standing in solidarity with what I would argue is a social justice human rights issue. That Black Lives Matter, we are not saying that only Black Lives Matter. We're saying Black Lives Matter too. That in addition to everyone else whose lives seem to matter, and we're reminded from the time we're born until we die, that there's some lives that are very important in this country, and there's some lives that matter. That's what Black lives is about. I mean, it's been tied, of course, to this the deaths and the murders at the hands of rogue cops and would-be cops. I'm thinking of Zimmerman, even would-be cops, and the ways in which they criminalize the Black body, the ways in which they disrespect and they do not honor the Black body, the ways in which they shoot us and let our bodies just lie in a street for 3 and 4 hours, or they're releasing 44 bullets at us because we're holding up a wallet and they're not sure what we're doing, or they're taking us off to prison like Sandra Bland, and then you end up, the person committed suicide. When you look at her life, it doesn't seem to add up. And there are no answers for this. So my book, Letters to My Black Sons, Raising Boys in a Post-Racial America, is my attempt to try to pour some light and some love and some hope and some truth into that. When I first realized that I was pregnant with my first son, who's now 14 going on 15, I wrote him a letter at 3 a.m. in the morning, and I spelled out what I wasn't going to do. Like, you're not going to change me, and your needs will not come before mine, and it's about my career, and you're just going to you're not taking me off my path. That's what I wrote. That's what I wrote. And you can follow through the book and realize that changed very quickly. The first time he cried and he was hungry and I had to drop everything, I realized he was already bending me to meet his will. And then realizing that I'm raising not just one Black son, but 2, and I'm co-parenting with my husband. Every step of the way I've written a letter to them, whether it was when they learned to walk or potty training them. And the letters in the beginning were all about just being happy as a young mother and what the world offered them, and this idea that I thought my husband and I could educate ourselves and make enough money so they wouldn't have to ever experience what has been happening. And when Trayvon Martin was brutally murdered, I realized at that moment that I'm raising 2 Black men in a society where they essentially are marked from birth. They are marked to be underachievers. They are marked to be on their way to prison. They are marked never to be at the table where conversations that determine the livelihood of their own people are being had. And so my letters had to change. And instead of talking about the beautiful things that the world has to offer, the letters became marching calls. This is what you need to do to be able to prepare yourself to navigate and negotiate your way through this world as a Black man in America.
Once again, we want to thank you for joining us. We'll be back with more from Dr. Whitehead when we return.